Okay, let's go ahead and get started with today's session's tips and tricks, underrated tools in Alteryx. My name is Joe Miller, and I'm the Senior Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx. And today we hope to get you an opportunity to maybe get a peek at a tool or some tools that you may not have used or may save you some time in your development process, aka the tools that if you didn't know they exist, they're going to be game changers and really change the way that you start thinking about your data. So when we start looking at this, the way I can best describe a lot of these tools will be advanced parsing and population type of tools. So more to come on that in terms of what we'll actually learn here. But before we do, I have a few housekeeping items that we're just going to talk about real quick. First of which is that by default, everybody is muted in this session. So I will not be able to hear anybody if they're trying to talk into it. The best way to get a hold of me is via the Q&A panel. So there's a couple panels that you can use on WebEx. I definitely prefer as a presenter to see that Q&A because I can select whether I've answered a question verbally or not. And it allows me just to make sure that I can cover off on everybody's questions before they get to the end of the session. So this is one of those sessions where there isn't really a specific business use case. We'll show you a file that has some issues and some tools that get around it. But it's not necessarily a problem that we're going to be solving. We're actually focusing on the process or the tools that you might not be using today. So before we get into the actual tools themselves, let's cover off on some upcoming trainings, some background, and then we'll get into the designer itself. So I'm just going to drag over my web browser here just to show you. For many of you who entered into this meeting here today, you likely came through this post 2019, February 12th. Here's where you joined. You'll also notice that there is an attachment. So if you'd like to see what we're going to build or follow along, or at least just have something on your desktop to take away from this, go ahead and download that just to view what we're going to be doing today. In terms of upcoming live trainings, I'm just going to zoom way back out. And you can see here that our calendar is populated with a number of trainings. So this is today's training. But if I were to scan up, you can see a whole list of things that are upcoming. So next week, we are going to be kicking off our 6-part series on advanced certification. So if you're looking to get advanced certified, we recommend that you subscribe to this, and you can see it's happening every other week, just so you have the opportunity to kind of let it sink in and kind of practice what you learned in those sessions, and then come back ready for the second one. So if you're really looking to bolster your ability to pass that advanced exam, or if you've had trouble with that, that would be a great session to join. The other one that's kind of interesting and outside is this Born to Solve series. So you'll see that we actually ran one last week. We did have some audio issues, so we can't post the playback. However, this one is actually aimed more towards problem solving with Alteryx. So in these trainings like today, we tend to show a pretty golden path, right? I, as the instructor, know exactly what I need to do to get to a particular result, but that's not the reality for a lot of people who are using Alteryx for the first time. So in these Born to Solve series, what we're actually doing is I'm bringing someone into the room with me, and I'm presenting them a problem that they have not practiced or have not seen, and we'll just try to expound on how they're thinking about the problem. And these are experienced solvers, by the way, right? So we're going to dive in and see where their head goes, how to think in Alteryx, right? And how the mindset shifts. And then once you do, the little roadblocks that come along the way, right? So it's a little bit more of the real life experience about how a problem gets solved. Whereas in some other trainings that we do, like parsing dates and times, we might show you how easy it is, but really when you're parsing dates and times, it could be very difficult. So we want to make sure that we address that and make sure that everybody has the opportunity. So you can see that we're booked all the way out till the end of April, so feel free to join in any of those sessions. We'd love to have you. So let's jump in some workflow background here. Sometimes we know we can do things better, right? And this, again, I said the session's pretty meta, but we don't know that there's really a better way or a faster way to do things. And this is something that I tell people who are coming into Alteryx for the first time, and I'll actually open my Alteryx here for a second. For most of you, you could actually do probably 70, 80% of your work just with this tool set. Now, it's not going to be optimal or fast, and you might not have to use a lot of them to achieve that result, but you can do that. And I say that more as a word of encouragement to those who are starting out in Alteryx for the first time. because anything else that we start looking at are some sort of enhancement on those tools. And some of them, for sure, are specialty, so if you're getting the spatial, but for most people, at least being familiar with this favorites palette is going to be the biggest leap for them actually using that. So what we're going to be talking about today is just beyond the breadth of what we're showing here and saying, like, now that you're a favorites, like, how do you actually start enhancing? What tools are underrated? What did you know or not know was there all along? So we're going to cover off on that during this session here today. So what we're going to do is going to introduce some of these tools, right? And for some of you, you can decide for this today's training how apropos this will be for you. But you can see that what we're going to be covering off on is some of the more robust parsing tools, like multi-field formula and multi-row formula. We're going to cover on some developer tools, like dynamic input, dynamic select, and dynamic rename, and then some of the data cleansing stuff. So really some strong tools if you haven't really gotten to use them before. So I am just going to exit back out of here and pop out to the workflow and talk about some of the tools that we're going to be using today. Get my PowerPoint back up here. The first of which is the renaming fields using a formula. And this is using a tool called the dynamic rename. If you haven't used the dynamic rename, your life is about to change because this tool is massively valuable. And what I'm showing you here today is just one fragment of the usefulness, and we'll actually show you a little bit more inside the actual designer itself. But what this tool does is it allows you to rename the fields within your table based on some sort of rule, right? In this case, we could set a rule or a rename mode based on a formula. There's some other things that we can do. So there's options to do things like rename them using the first row of data. So sometimes people import their data where all the headers are in the first row of data. You can rename it that way. You can take it from another data set, right? You can say, hey, what's the field names on this data set? Go ahead and apply them to this one over here. So this is actually a tool that has multiple inputs. And it's really nice because if you're a person who's really trying to create a high fidelity data environment and data asset, and you just have a data dictionary of meta info, you can just quickly slap on and apply that meta info into your actual workflow without having to use that select tool to just rename them manually every time. So that first tool that we're going to use is the formula. Okay, so I'm just going to jump out here and I say, let's just alternate back and forth. Sometimes I do this all in presentation mode, but I want to make sure that we address them one at a time. So let's go ahead and connect to some data. So I'm going to drag an input data tool onto my canvas, and we're quickly going to configure it. Now, if you downloaded it, it's likely already configured. You could just build something parallel to something that's already there if you want to try it yourself. But I'm just going to quickly connect to one myself. So let me just dig into my desktop here. And find this population spreadsheet. Okay. And I'm going to look for the sheet that I want from inside this Excel workbook. In fact, there's only one. So I'm going to connect to this. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just, like, I would just want people to take a second, either to themselves or in the Q&A window, just to observe some of the things that might be subpar about this data set as they see it right now. What are the things that we want to change? What are the things that we want to improve? So for me, there's a few things that I see. We see this really common paradigm that we see people use when they use Excel, in that they use a hierarchy, right? Here's a state of Alabama, here's the counties underneath it, and then the cities within that county, and then the population, right? But we see this hierarchy, and for us, for anyone using Excel today, it's just insinuated, right, that anything that's null is the value from above it, right? So all of these must be Alabama. Here through here must also apply to Antagua County, or these should apply to Baldwin County. That's really good if the data just has to be understood by people. But unfortunately, we're working with machines, right? We're talking about doing data at scale and being able to tell the machine how to interpret it. So in a complete vacuum, if I was just to pass this record into my machine, how would it know what state it came from or what county? it wouldn't, right? Because it doesn't have that same thing that we have as humans when we step into a spreadsheet and just insinuate to ourselves that, oh yeah, whatever the value above, it must be redundant, so they didn't bother in writing it in. So that's an assumption that we're going to make in this, is that we really need to clean this up so we're not having a lot of null values. Some other things that I see is there's a lot of underscores throughout this data set. There's numbers. However, these numbers have those comma values within them, which could give us a little bit of trouble. And you'll notice that some of these actual city, county, state, all these headers, some have underscores, some are title case, right? So what can we use to dynamically rename these? For many people, they might just go in and use a select tool. So I'm just going to drag in a select tool. My habit is always to type it into the global search. But you could drag it from your favorites and then go in and actually rename this female pop, male pop, total pop. And that's good. But for many of you, you might be working with data sets that either come in every month, right, and you need to do this all the time for each new data set, or you just have a data set that is so wide, has so many fields, that that task alone to rename everything might take you an hour, right? So what do you do to accommodate those, and how do we dynamically handle those? So this is where we queue that dynamic rename. So I'm going to go all the way over to the developer palette here. Now, if you don't see this palette, it's likely because you don't have it exposed. If you go over to this little plus sign at the top of this tool palette, add and remove tools, you can select which palettes you want. So by default, I have everything selected, but you can go ahead and choose developer. Okay, and even within developer, you could choose which tools you need to show up. So if you're not seeing that by default, I believe at the default installation, it kind of cuts off right after this transform. But if you wanted to see more, that's how you would get to it. So let's go over and, again, there's me typing it in. Let's go over to our developer palette, unless I deselected it here. There we go. The nice thing, too, is anytime that this is these tools are shut off from the developer palette, you can always still search for them. They'll still show up. So I'm going to go ahead and find that dynamic rename tool. I'm just going to drop it down here. Okay, and at this point in time, I want to make sure that everything that has an underscore is replaced with a space. So if you're not familiar with writing formulas, feel free just to see what I'm doing. This can be a little bit challenging if you haven't done it before, but if you have, this will make perfect sense. So I'm going to go to functions and say I need to rename these fields. By default, no matter what, right, remember that field names are always string values. Even if the field name is the number 1, it's really a string value. So I'm going to scroll through here and find something that will replace a character within my string. There it is, replace character. So I have to choose what field I'm going to use. And you'll see that there's a couple options, right? We have the workflow constants, but we also have this current field option. Current field is essentially any field that's selected up here, right? So what states do I want, or what fields do I want this formula rename logic applied to? Well, the nice thing is I'll just say all, because if this data set changes, it will still accommodate for everything. So I'm going to say for that current field, and I'll double click it in there, find the character underscore and replace it with a space, right? And I literally typed in a white space character there. So I'm going to go ahead and run that workflow and take a look. I can see state, county, city, female pop, male pop, total pop now has that underscore removed, but now I want to title case it. So I'm going to have to find another expression in order to accomplish this. Now, I'm going to do something that's essentially called nesting logic, which says, I've done this to the current field, but now I want to, on top of what I've done there, I want to also title case it. So I'm just going to create a new line and find the function called title case. Okay, and it's asking what field I want to title case, and I'll say title case exactly what I just did here, right? So I essentially wrapped it all around in parentheses, saying title case all the fields. I'm going to give that another run, and now my data is good to go, or my headers at the very least. We have to explore a little bit into our data a little bit more. But at least you get it, right? And I'm just going to show you here some of the other things that you might not be familiar with. But we worked with a formula, but I could just add a prefix to everything, right? So let's say this all should start with the year 2000. A really quick way of adding a prefix, right? I could choose if it's a suffix, or if everything had a prefix, the same prefix, right? So I'll just undo what I did with a dynamic rename here. I want to remove all with a 2000 prefix. And it's back to normal, right? So one other thing that's kind of fun too is if I wanted to turn this row number 1 into my new headers, I could take the field names from the first row of data. And you can see Alabama has now become the header. And this is really helpful sometimes when you're trying to import data from like the middle of your spreadsheet and you miss it by 1. You can just move it up and inherit those field names. And then you can see that this is actually a 2-input tool. So you can actually take field names from another data set, right? I could actually apply the correct ones to this data set and say take it from the right input metadata and just rename all of those fields so they are correct. I know I'm kind of overlapping and these tools are somewhat cousins, but at least you can see what I'm doing. I'm taking the field names here and saying from this data set, which has the year 2000, just rewrite them all with what's in this data set. So really cool stuff in terms of dynamic rename and can really enhance your development time. Now, some of these, what you may not know, is actually available inside the select tool. So I can actually highlight all the fields, and you can see I have a lot of similar options like adding prefixes or adding suffixes. But this isn't really a dynamic solution. So if I added prefix today of 2000, any new fields that show up tomorrow, you know, where it might be dog population, for example, it won't rename it 2000. Whereas in this case, if I had to set a prefix, it would. So overall, this dynamic rename is a really solid tool for being able to rename your data set quickly. So I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there's any questions. Okay, sounds like we're tracking well. So the next one is this multi-field formula tool. And so we talked already, you know, about that dynamic rename, how it had that current field name value. So now we're actually working in a way that's so dynamic. We're not explicitly calling out particular field names. We're actually calling out just the value that represents the field names, right? And this formula tool is no different that you're going to see. So have you ever gotten a situation where you're using the formula tool and you had 25 different fields and you had to write the same formula again and again and again? That's the multi-field formula tool. What you can do is write one single formula and select what fields you want that formula to enact upon. And this can be really good in terms of data cleansing and making sure that everything is really clean to go. Now, we have a data cleansing tool itself, but I think at its core, this tool provides more longevity and value and flexibility versus the set of selections that come with the data cleansing tool. So I'm going to do something really simple, and I'm going to say, hey, I know in my data set, if I jump back here, I've got, I don't know how many states I have. If I have North Dakota, there's probably a space and there's probably an underscore. I need to clean up counties and remove all these underscores, and cities, if any two named cities with underscores, I want to make sure that underscore is replaced as well. And what I don't want to do is write this one by one by one. I just want to do it in one single pass. So it's going to be the multi-field formula tool to the rescue. So again, I could accomplish this, and this is where I say in those favorites tool, you could accomplish anything that you ever need to with the favorites tools, and this formula tool is in there, but it's just going to be a little bit slower. Let's go over to the multi-field formula and just make life a little easier on us. So the fields I need to address, I have to select here, but I'm going to choose, you can select all types of, but I'm going to select text because really I'm working with state, county, city. You can see that even though these might appear as numbers to us, they're actually not because they have commas in them, and that's considered a string value. So let me run this to make sure my metadata is refreshed here. There we go. So I'm going to select which which fields I'd like to apply my formula tool and quickly write one out. So we're going to use a function that we've already seen once in this session, that replace character. Select that. Choose which variable you want. Now in this particular tool, you can actually choose any of the fields if you ever explicitly want to name them. So let's say I just had a multiplier field and I want to apply that multiplier across 100 fields. I could select that explicit field and use that every time in my formula. But in this case, I just want to say, hey, for this current field, aka whichever is selected here, think of this as selecting all three of them at once. I'm going to look for an underscore and replace it with a space. We're going to give that a run. And looks like it didn't quite take. Let's take a look at see what happened here. Oh, so I've fallen victim to my own tip to everybody. So the one thing to really know that's really important about this tool, if I toggle between these two, does anyone see the difference? Yeah, you'll see that I've created new fields. I keep missing this toggle here. There you go. You can see that I'm creating new fields. So many people, myself included just now, look exactly right back at these particular fields and say, hey, I didn't see the underscore happen. Oh, it's over here, right? It's prefixed everything with new. You'll see that there's an option under here to copy output fields add. If you deselect that, what it's going to do is not create these new fields. It's just going to update these fields. Perfect. So this is as what I expect it to be. Now, the other thing to call out as well, right, is imagine you have a data set that already runs off the screen and people that get stuck on that because they have to scroll over and discover that there's new fields there. So be careful about selecting this. I understand by default it's selected so you don't overwrite your fields, but it's something you need to be careful of. Now, the other thing that I want to do just to make sure that I'm consistent with the actual data itself is I'm going to title case it. Right, so I'm going to go back to my functions, string, find that title case, and just say, hey, whatever I did to all those fields, just wrap it in a title case, and we're good to go. I already had someone comment in, if I knew this tool yesterday, it would have been perfect. Yeah, so it's definitely a better late than never type of thing. Because once you start seeing this tool in action, it will be more helpful along the way. So when I reference this data cleansing tool is very similar to this multi-field formula, right? I could have gone in here and said remove punctuation or white space, right? But I couldn't have actually replaced the punctuation with white space. So you can see where that flexibility came in. I can only do a certain set of operations. And if I crack this open, this is actually macro, you can see it's a series of multi-field formula tools. So if you really want to harness the raw power of a data cleansing tool, or just even a data analysis tool, this is the tool that you need to be doing. Okay, so I am, just because I can, right, I'm going to update my population values. So these population values in their innermost have a comma inside of them, delimiting the thousands. Now, for many of those who don't know, simply just changing this to a numeric type, let me just change 1 to, they're all round numbers, so I'll go in64, is not going to work. You can see that I'm going to get all these conversion errors saying that there is an issue. And you can see if I scroll down here that I lose a lot of numbers, right? Essentially, what happened is a comma is considered a string value, and as soon as I convert to number, it starts feeding in all those numeric characters until it occurs on a string character. So as soon as it found a 2 comma a couple thousand, right, it truncated the rest of it. So let me come back here. 2059, and it just turned to 2, right? Imagine the problems that that can cause. So I'm just going to go in here and just say, hey, for female, male, and total, let's just remove punctuation from those, aka commas. I'll let that run. Okay, my numbers look a little bit better. Now, if I were actually to go in and convert that female population to that N64, you'll see that all those errors are gone and everything plays nice because I don't have that string character in there anymore. And by the way, I could have accomplished this same thing with that multi-field formula. I could have just said replace any commas with nothing, and you can actually write nothing by saying no space, right? So that's something that I could have done to have accomplished what I needed to. So things are looking up and up. Data's starting to shape up. Everything's title cased. We're happy with that. But now I need to populate this information, right? So let's go back to the beginning and say, here's record 9. And if I were just to send this to my computer or to even any peers inside my organization, just this information, they'd be like, fully, where's that, right? And probably even more so if you had an actual city name that exists in multiple places, like Louisville, or as we call it in Colorado, Louisville. I kid you not, people in Colorado say Louisville for their own city. But yeah, so how do we understand what city, country, and state each of these are from? What I need to do is have a workflow that essentially says, populate the data downward, right? I need to populate these nulls with Baldwin County and these with Antagua County, right? And I'm sorry for anybody from Alabama if I'm butchering that one. But anyway, so that's the next issue that we need to solve along the way. And what I'm going to do is this particular tool is actually pretty complex. So what I'm going to do is use a visualization to hopefully get this across, okay? So this is called the multi-row formula tool. And let me actually just go to this view very quickly before I visualize it. So we did multi-field, right, which is actually looking at each field across the data set. But now the multi-row is a tool that you can use to create calculations using rows above and below a row that you're analyzing, okay? So imagine I'm that null value in county, and I don't know where to pull a value from. I can choose to look above me or below me to populate that data. For those of you coming from a database background, this is your lag and lead function. So this is what you really need to use to kind of populate data into your data set. So this tool is a little bit difficult to navigate when you're first using it, mainly because you have to be very visual about what's happening when you write an expression. So let's pretend I have a data set that looks like this, just to understand the behavior of the multi-row formula tool. Okay, I've got 3 stores, all for the month of November and December, and they have a certain sales value, and I want to apply some sort of rank to those stores for each month. So I have to choose how to group these values together and what to do when the values don't exist, and create a store rank, blah, 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 right? A lot of stuff. What I tell people to focus on first is this logic, right? How do I want to calculate store rank, right? So presumably, we'd want to say, hey, we sort them in a way that the stores are ordered from best performing to lowest performing. And then from there, we could say, hey, what was the store rank from the row before it? And then just add 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. So the first thing I need to do is sort my data, right? I need to sort them so I understand what was the highest sales for the month of November, second highest, third highest, right? And then you can see the sort starts all over again for December. Okay, now we need to implement our logic, okay? And for me, since I'm ranking them by month, I want to go 1, 2, 3 for November, and then 1, 2 for December, right? I want the rank to start over with again. So I'm going to say, hey, for this ranking logic, group by month, aka start all over again, right? Start the logic from scratch once you reach December, okay? So it's going to create those 2 groups and say, hey, here's the groups and I'm going to rank these. And of course, this is absolutely visual. You won't see this in your designer, but this is really what's happening underneath the hood, right? Now it's going to go through and rank them. Now, there are a couple options when I was going to open the multi-field formula tool, is you can choose what to do for a value that doesn't exist, okay? So let's take row A, and the important thing to know about Designer is it always processes rows top down, right? Especially in this particular tool, it's going to do the first row, then the second row, then the third row. It's going to process them ordinally. So the first row that it's going to be looking at is row A, right? And say, I need to apply some sort of rank to it. Well, our logic says, hey, look at the rank that existed before that one and then add 1. Well, there was no store that was higher than store A in November. Hence, that value doesn't exist, so it should be the value of 0, right? So row 1 store rank of 0, and you can assign this via a drop down inside the multi-row formula tool, right? Plus 1. So 0 plus 1 is equal to 1. And again, it's still analyzing this row, but just looking around at other rows. So it's finally going to say, hey, that value should be 1. And it's going to move on. Next, it's going to move on to row 2, which is that store name C. And it's going to do the same logic, okay? So what was the store rank for the row above it? Well, it was 1. And 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So the store rank is 2. And if I were to repeat that again, it continues to look up. And you can see it's essentially dragging this value down and just adding 1 every time. Now that we get to December, right, we told it to group by month, so it's going to start all over again. It's going to say, hey, there was no other stores higher than this in the group of December, right? So implicitly, there's a 0 there. So it's going to say, since there are no higher reg stores than this in December, we're going to add 1 and start all over again, right? And you can see that the logic carries on. So finally, when you walk away from this, you have this new store rank top down. Ours is going to be a little bit different because we're actually not doing a calculation. We're like doing a population process. So how did we achieve all of those things? You know, if you understood it at a very high level, this is where our logic goes. And that looks very daunting with all the comments in there. You can see there's if then else. You have variables, right? So here's where you can select, you know, if you want to look up 1 row back or 1 row forward, aka 1 row below it. Up here, you could toggle, if I wanted 5 rows, you'll see that you could have the ability to look 5 rows behind or 5 rows ahead of you. You can see this is our group by field. This is where I chose the month for our store. And then what to do if the values don't exist, right? We chose 0 or empty. And I know a lot of this is really tough to understand, so we're just going to jump into it and show you how to do in Designer in terms of populating. So I'm going to drag in that multi-row formula tool. Okay, and let's address which field we want to talk about first. The first one that I want to work on is Alabama. So instead of creating a new field, I'm just going to update the existing one and say state. Okay, and what I essentially want to do is say, if the row is empty, take the value of state above it. Okay, now let's look at this data really quick, right? So if the value is empty, which it is not, then take the state above it. So since it was not empty, it would just stay that way and we'd move on. If the state is empty, take the value above it. It is, so Alabama is going to populate into here and we'll move on. If the state of, or this value of record 3 is empty, take the state above it. Now, this is where people get tricked up because visually right now it looks null, but during the actual tool processing, it has already visited this row and it has already populated Alabama. So this too would become Alabama. And you can see that would continue to string all the way down until we occur on another state where it is not empty, right? And it wouldn't take a value above it. So let's go ahead and write a statement that would achieve this. The first thing that I'm going to show you, and I'm not going to use, is that I could watch these variables as I tick up these number of rows. Here's where I can start looking at, you know, what was the value 4 rows ago in state. You have that ability to toggle up that view. For most people, they're only working typically in a capacity that's probably more like row -1. So I'm going to say a conditional statement first. If, and let's write a condition, and this one I'm testing if the field is empty or not. So I'm going to go to function test is empty. I'm going to put in the variable state, right? Since I'm analyzing this row, I don't want to populate with something else if it is not empty. If it is empty, we want to take the value from the state above it. So I'm going to go to row 1, state. If not, then just leave it as its own state that it's labeled there, and if. Let's run it and take a peek. Now, for many times, right, this is going to take a couple of tries. I know I made that look pretty easy. But really, it's going to take a few tries a lot of times, right? Especially when you start working with numbers, then these values that don't exist become a little bit more difficult. Now, I know a lot of people by default like to hit this, group by everything, and that's just going to be a huge problem along the way, right? Because you can see what it's trying to do is group every single field, and every single field, once you group them all together, is unique. So it restarts the logic over and over again for each field. So I encourage people to stay away from these until they have a solid expression written, and then they want to break it down by month or by state, right? So state is populated. We're happy with that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing for county, okay? And this logic is pretty much identical, so what I'm going to do is just copy the tool and just update it. So I'm going to say, let's update county. I need to make sure that I update all these values with county, right? So current row county. I'm going to go then previous row county. Else, just leave it as the current county. We'll give it a run. So now you can see that all of these belong to Autauga County. All these belong to Baldwin, Barbour, Bibb, Blount. This data is looking a lot more full. So now if I sent this particular record to an associate, they're like, yes, I know exactly where that is because I have all the information to understand what's happening here. And that's the multi-field formula tool. Or sorry, the multi-row formula tool. I'm sorry. That's the biggest piece. Now I'm going to show you one more tool just for the fun of it. I'm going to show you the dynamic select tool. And I'm going a little bit off script here. Dynamic select tool is really interesting because it allows you to dynamically select fields from your data set that you want to see based on some sort of rules. So let's see what happens if I said, find me only fields that are int64. Looks like only female population is. If I go back to my select tool, you can see that was the only one I selected as int64. Now if I updated them all, and I was looking for those int64s, all of them would come true, right? Now the dynamic select tool doesn't just stop there. I have a lot of options, so I could also select by formula and just said, find me where name is or contains population. So I'm going to find my contains function and string contains variable where the name of the field contains pop. What if we chose state? All right, so this is a really fun way of being able to work with your data because if you you had a massive data set for every year and every 12 months was built as a field, you could pull out all the Novembers and just run a year-over-year analysis over that. It could be a lot of fun. So there's some fun tools in there. So let's look at some questions here. As you run items in your process map, the if statement to populate if they do not achieve the desired result, what is the result? What is the process for rewinding the changes? So what happens if I write this, right, and I don't like this? So the important thing to note is at no point in time am I altering this Excel file. I could open this up right now, and you'll see that it's still, and I'm loading it on my other screen here, you can still see that it's in its original state. I am not changing it to date. this is just a development environment to see how we're going to change the data, but we haven't explicitly said commit. The only time that I'm really committing my data back to that is via an output data tool. So if I went there and said the population, let's write this all back into the population file, into the population sheet, I would then overwrite it with the new updated view. So to roll it back, right, you would simply have to delete these or just never do anything with them at all. I know some people who don't want to lose their progress that said, hey, I was so close here, I just need to change it just a hair, but I want to keep it around for reference. You can just start a new stream, right? You can go into another direction and use this one as your go forward production, but these would be like, oh yeah, here's what worked at one point, and then I could delete them when I feel a little bit more comfortable. Any other questions on what I just talked about there so far? Okay, so I've got one more really important thing that I'm going to show everybody, and that's being able to work with Excel files. So let me just go to my desktop here and select a workbook, okay? So this particular workbook has many, many, many sheets. And for many people, you'll see that you can only select one at a time. So usually what they do is they say, here's my 2003 data input. I'm going to go back here and create one for 2004, right? They go back, create one for 2005, and it seems incredibly monotonous, right? Especially when you can see that we have at least 20 of these, and presumably that would also change every single year. Well, we have a way to bring in all sheets at one time under one schema, okay? And it actually is a series of a couple tools. So I would, if you're working with Excel workbooks at this point in time, I would ingrain this process into your brain, because this is going to be so critical to making sure that you're really fast on development time. So for many of you who have not explored it, there's actually an option here that you may say to yourself, why would I ever select this, right? Why would I ever need a list of sheet names? Well, you can actually use this to start the process of being able to analyze what sheets you want to bring into the designer. So more than, I guess what I should really say is what we're doing is creating a data set of the data we want to bring in. I promised it was going to be meta, right? So I need to identify what sheets I want to bring in. So in this case, I want to bring in everything except for that sheet 1, because everything else is the yearly data that I need. I could choose to use a filter statement that says filter out this particular sheet. I'm just going to use something, and I'll just go to my preparation palette and use sample tool and just say skip the first row, because that's a data set that I don't want. So now I have a new list of sheet names that I want to bring into the designer. Let's go back over to the developer tool palette. I keep missing it here. And use something called the dynamic input tool. Okay, the dynamic input tool is basically, you can think of a batch process to not only bring in one tool, but bring in a whole bunch of files based on a list, right? And lucky for us, we've compiled the list right here. So we're providing this tool with a list of items that it needs to read in. We just need to set a few parameters to make sure that it considers these sheets in the way that we want it to. The first of which is we need to specify an input template source. So what I need to do is select a file that is representative of what this data is going to look like. Okay, so I'll just select the year 2003. Now, why does it do this? So it is possible that even though you have sheets all named the same, that some have different number of fields, or they're named incorrectly or differently. There's not a really clean way to match them up. This tool actually does some checks for you, right? It says, are they named the same, and do they have the same amount of fields? If they do follow this template, right? If they do match what I have in year 2003, then go ahead, bring them on in. We'll bring them in with part of the data set. If it doesn't, right? If, let's say, 2006, the year 2006 had a really weird data structure and didn't match the year 2003, it would send a warning saying, hey, I don't think this should be a part of your data just because it doesn't really match. Now, there are ways around that, but this is really the way that it plays safe. So now that I've set up some sort of template to dictate, the rules that each of these sheets should follow when it comes in and from what file, I just need to select the list of data sources that I've generated from this input data tool. And that's the list of sheet names. So I'm going to go ahead and add a browse to this and just run this workflow. What I'd like to point people towards once I'm done with this is that I can see down here in my message log that it brought in 155 records from year 2003, year 2004, 2005, so on and so forth. So I can see that I've successfully been able to connect to each of these, and they've been compiled into one master data set of 1860 records. Okay, so I can see year 2003. If I were to scroll down, you can see all my fiscal years from each of these Excel sheets coming in. So really an irreplaceable process if you're not working inside the actual dynamic input tool today. That will soon become a really invaluable resource. And usually you think of these two tool combos, right? Bring it in with the list with the input data, read it in with the dynamic input. In between, you could slot in some logic saying like exclude these files or include these, right? Make sure that you can define what should be going into that tool before it gets there. So I know I threw a lot at you, but hopefully there's at least one or two that each of you said, hey, I could use that in my day-to-day, and that would greatly improve my speed. So if you do need more support beyond this, go ahead and check out the Alteryx community. There's a wealth of information on each of these tools that we've talked about there today. Even the Alteryx Academy, right? So you're here for live training, but we do have interactive lessons that walk you through some of these tools at a little bit of a closer level. And then if there's something technically, if you're having trouble getting your designer up and running as you'd expect, go ahead and hit us at support@alteryx.com. And that's it for today. I'm just going to hang on the line and answer a few questions, but if not, I really appreciate you joining, and feel free to join us on any of those sessions coming up all the way out until April. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I'll be on the line for any more questions.